The sky over the village of Omi was a deceptive, brilliant blue, but Nara could feel the air curdling like spoiled milk. It was a sensation that started in the marrow of her bones, a low, vibrating hum that the rest of the world seemed deaf to. She stood at the edge of the communal square, her fingers stained a deep, earthy green from the fever grass she had been crushing for the midwife. While the other villagers laughed and spread their harvests of maize and yam to dry under the scorching sun, Nara felt a sudden, icy shiver. She closed her eyes and for a split second, the sun-drenched square vanished. In its place, she saw a wall of grey water, the sound of ancient mahogany trees snapping like dry twigs, and the terrified bleating of goats being swept into the mud. Nara gasped, her eyes snapping open. She knew this feeling. It was the curse of knowledge, a gift passed down from her grandmother that the village elders had rebranded as a mark of the devil. She dropped her bundle of herbs and ran toward the center of the square, where the village head sat discussing the season's bounty. "The sky is lying," she cried out, her voice cracking with a desperation that silenced the crowd. "Gather the livestock and move to the high ridges now. A great wind is coming, and the river will swallow the valley before the sun sets." A heavy silence followed. The village head looked up at the cloudless horizon, and then back at Nara with a look of pure contempt. "You again, Nara?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "The sun is high, and there isn't a breath of wind. Are you so bored with your weeds that you must invent ghosts to scare us?" Laughter rippled through the square. A neighbor, a woman Nara had helped with a persistent cough only a week prior, clutched her child closer. "She talks to the air," the woman whispered loudly. "She sees things in her sleep. My mother was right, that girl has spirit water in her eyes. She's a witch." Nara pleaded, her hands outstretched, but the more she spoke of the coming darkness, the more the villagers retreated in fear. They didn't see a girl trying to save them, they saw a monster trying to hex their harvest. By mid-afternoon the first sign appeared, a strange, unnatural stillness that made the birds stop singing. Then the horizon turned the color of a bruised plum. Within the hour the witch girl's prophecy became a nightmare. The wind arrived first, a howling beast that tore the thatch from the roofs. Then came the rain, so heavy it felt like stones falling from the heavens. The village square became a graveyard of drowned crops and shattered wood. People screamed as they scrambled for the high ground Nara had pointed to hours earlier. When the storm finally broke the next morning, leaving the village a muddy ruin, the survivors did not look at Nara with gratitude. They looked at her with a fresh, burning hatred. "She called it down," the village head shouted, pointing a trembling finger at her as she stood amidst the wreckage. "She didn't warn us. She cursed us. She saw it because she made it happen." The mob mentality took hold faster than the floodwaters had. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a scapegoat for their loss. Before the mud had even dried on her feet, the elders gathered. There would be no trial. Nara was given a torn nylon bag and a single command: leave and never return, or the spirits she served would be joined by her own soul. Banished and rejected, Nara turned her back on the only home she had ever known. As she walked toward the distant, smog-choked skyline of the city, she realized that having the power to see the truth was useless if the world was too blinded by fear to hear it. Destiny was pulling her away from the ruins of the past and toward a billionaire's mansion, where another kind of storm was waiting to break. Inside the silver and glass towers of the Vanderbilt estate, the air was always a perfect 22 buxy, filtered and scrubbed of any impurity. Yet to Leo it felt like the inside of a tomb. He sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private suite, his body framed by the expensive machinery of his existence. Beneath him, the carbon fiber wheelchair hummed with a faint, electric pulse, a piece of engineering so advanced it cost more than a luxury sedan. Yet it was ultimately just a throne of disappointment. Leo looked down at his legs, draped in custom-tailored silk trousers. To anyone else they looked perfect, athletic even, thanks to the grueling daily sessions with his private physiotherapists. But to Leo they were merely heavy, silent weights attached to his torso, unresponsive and distant, like two strangers he was forced to carry everywhere he went. Across the room, his father, Arthur Vanderbilt, was paced the length of the marble floor, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders at a neurosurgeon in Zurich. Arthur did not walk, he marched, his every step a testament to his belief that the world bowed to a man with enough will and a large enough bank account. He stopped in front of a giant monitor displaying a 3D rendering of Leo's spine. The scan was a masterpiece of medical imaging, showing every vertebrae and nerve ending in luminous high-definition detail. The stem cell results from the lab in Singapore arrived this morning, Arthur said, hanging up the phone and turning to his son with a feverish intensity in his eye. They've developed a new synthetic protein scaffold. It's logical, Leo. It's precise. We fly out on Tuesday. I've already bought the clinic's entire schedule for the month. Leo didn't turn away from the window. He watched a hawk circling high above the city's skyline, envious of its effortless movement. Dad, we've done the synthetic scaffolds. We've done the electromagnetic stimulation and the spinal cord mapping in Switzerland. Every time you say it's logical, and every time I come home in the same chair. Arthur flinched, but his face quickly hardened back into a mask of relentless determination. For Arthur, Leo's paralysis was not a medical condition, it was a business problem that hadn't been solved yet. He believed in data, in cold hard facts, and in the supremacy of modern science. He had built an empire on logic, and he could not accept that there was a blockage in his son that his money could not penetrate. This is different, Arthur insisted, his voice dropping into that low, persuasive tone that had closed billion-dollar deals. The technology has evolved. We have the best minds, the best machines. Failure isn't an option. But Leo felt the failure every morning when he tried to wiggle a toe and met only a terrifying hollow silence. His life had become a series of sterile rooms and the smell of antiseptic. He was poked, prodded, and measured by men with multiple degrees who looked at him like a malfunctioning engine, rather than a boy. They analyzed his blood, his nerves, and his bone density, but they never looked at his soul. They saw the what of his injury, but they were blind to the why of his despair. He was a prisoner of his father's hope, trapped in a carbon fiber cage that kept him alive but prevented him from truly living. As Arthur began to explain the chemical composition of the new protein, Leo closed his eyes, wishing for anything that didn't involve a needle or a computer screen. He didn't know that miles away, a girl with stained hands and no shoes was already walking toward him, carrying a truth that no laboratory could ever synthesize. The sun was a searing eye in the sky over the city's Central Park, but for Arthur Vanderbilt it was merely a backdrop for his frustration. He marched alongside Leo's wheelchair, his polished Italian leather shoes crunching rhythmically against the gravel path. His eyes were glued to his smartwatch, and his voice was a sharp, clipped staccato as he argued into a Bluetooth earpiece about a merger in Dubai. To Arthur, the park was not a place for leisure. It was a temporary office where his son could get the required fresh air, prescribed by the latest team of Swiss specialists. Leo, however, sat in a state of quiet withdrawal, his hands resting limply on the carbon fiber armrests. He watched the other children, the ones who ran without thinking, whose muscles fired in a perfect, unconscious symphony of movement. Then the air seemed to shift. The ambient noise of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, faded into a strange, expectant silence. Standing near a cluster of ancient oaks was a girl who looked as though she had been carved from the earth itself. Nara stood in a simple faded brown dress, her feet bare and dusted with the pale soil of the road. Her hair was a crown of natural coils, and her eyes held a clarity that was unnerving, as if she were looking not at them but through them. As Arthur leaned over a treadmill-like diagnostic machine his team had set up on the path to measure Leo's passive leg tension, Nara stepped forward. The movement was so deliberate that the two broad-shouldered security guards in black suits immediately tensed, their hands moving toward their waistbands. Arthur didn't even look up at first. his finger tracing a graph on a tablet. I told the press no photos today, he snapped, assuming she was a beggar or a curious onlooker. Move her along. But Nara didn't move. She ignored the guards and walked directly into the center of the path, her gaze locking onto Leo. The metal you have wrapped around him is cold, she said, her voice, surprisingly steady, echoing with a depth that made Arthur finally freeze. It is trying to force a machine's will onto a human spirit. That is why he does not wait. Arthur lowered his tablet, his brow furrowing in a mixture of confusion and burgeoning rage. He took in her torn clothes and the green stains on her fingers. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with the practiced condescension of a man who dealt in billions. "We are in the middle of a medical evaluation. If you're looking for a handout, my assistant is in the black SUV." Nara took another step, her eyes never leaving Leo. The boy felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt of electricity at the base of his spine, a sensation more vivid than anything the German electrodes had ever produced. "I do not want your money, sir," Nara said, closing the distance until she stood at the very edge of the wheelchair. "I saw this boy in the silence of the night. I saw you weeping over his stillness. I am here because the earth told me his time to stand has come." Arthur let out a sharp, cynical laugh, turning to his head of security. "Is this a joke? Is she a local lunatic?" He turned back to Nara, his face reddening. "My son has a complex neurological blockage that has baffled the greatest minds in London and Singapore. We are using cutting-edge science. We don't need visions or earth stories from someone who clearly hasn't seen the inside of a schoolroom. Science looks at the wire, but it does not see the light passing through it," Nara replied calmly. She reached out a hand, not to touch Leo, but to gesture toward the ground. "There is a blockage, yes, but it is not in his bones. It is in the connection between his heart and his feet. You have spent millions trying to buy a cure, but you cannot buy a miracle. I can make your son walk again." The claim hung in the air, like a lightning bolt. One of the guards stepped forward to grab her arm, but Leo suddenly shouted, "Wait." The boy's voice was louder than Arthur had heard it in years. Leo was staring at Nara, his chest heaving. "Dad, look at her eyes. She's the girl from my dream. The one in the garden." Arthur looked from his trembling son to the ragged girl standing defiantly in the sun. Every logical fiber in his brain told him to have her removed, to call the police, to protect his son from the predatory witchcraft of the desperate. But as he looked at the diagnostic screen, he saw something impossible for the first time in 10 years. The sensors on Leo's legs were registering a faint, erratic pulse of activity. The machine couldn't explain it. Logic couldn't explain. In that moment of absolute silence, the billionaire's pride crashed into a father's desperate hope. The tension in the park was thick enough to choke the summer breeze, as Arthur Vanderbilt stood paralyzed by the reading on his tablet. The erratic pulse on the sensor was a jagged line of defiance against a decade of flat lines. He looked at Nara, whose stillness was a jarring contrast to the frantic clicking of his own mind. He was a man who lived by the sword of litigation and the shield of ironclad agreements. To him, every miracle had to have a price, and every promise required a penalty. He slowly lowered the device, his eyes narrowing into slits of icy calculation. If this girl was a fraud, a sophisticated grifter who had somehow hacked his sensors or studied his son's medical history, he would crush her. But if there was even a 1% chance that her presence was the catalyst for that pulse, he couldn't let her walk away. "You say you can do what the world's elite have failed to do," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register that made his security detail shift uneasily. "But in my world, words are empty air, unless they are backed by consequences. You want access to my son. You want to bring your Earth stories into my home. Fine. But we will do it on my terms." He turned to his head of security, snapping his fingers. "Call the legal team. I want a contract drawn up immediately. Medical endangerment, criminal trespass, and fraud. If she enters my gates and fails to deliver a standing walking boy within 7 days, she won't just be homeless. She will spend the next 20 years in a federal cell." Nara didn't flinch. She watched as a sleek black sedan arrived,
and a man in a sharp suit hurried out with a portable printer and a laptop. The contract was generated right there on the park gravel, a stack of papers filled with dense predatory legalese, designed to trap her. To Nara, the ink on the pages looked like a cage of thorns, but she didn't need to read the words to understand the spirit behind them. She saw the fear masked as anger in Arthur's eyes, and she saw the desperate hunger for life in Leo. "Sign it," Arthur commanded, thrusting a gold-plated pen toward her. "If you're a witch, as you say the world calls you, then surely you aren't afraid of a few pieces of paper. But know this, the moment we pass through my gates, you are under 24-hour surveillance. You eat what we give you, you go where we tell you, and you touch nothing without my permission. This isn't a guest visit, it's an intervention under guard." Nara took the pen. Her hand, calloused and stained with the green blood of herbs, looked out of place against the expensive stationery. She made a simple mark, a firm, dark line, accepting the weight of the billionaire's wrath. As she handed the pen back, Leo reached out and touched her sleeve, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was the first time Arthur had seen his son initiate contact with a stranger in years. The sight sent a pang of jealousy and terror through Arthur's heart, fueling his resolve to watch Nara like a hawk. The drive to the Vanderbilt mansion was a journey between two different realities. Nara sat in the back of the armored SUV, her eyes wide as the city of concrete and glass gave way to the secluded, ultra-wealthy enclave of the hill. When the massive iron gates swung open, revealing a fortress of white marble and manicured lawns, Nara felt the heavy, suffocating weight of artificial perfection. There were no wild weeds here, no unscripted growth. Everything was pruned, controlled and sterile. As they stepped into the grand foyer, the air conditioning hit Nara like a wall of ice. She felt the eyes of the uniformed staff, the maids, the cooks, the private nurses, all staring at her tattered dress and bare feet with a mixture of disgust and bewilderment. Arthur didn't offer her a room or a meal. He pointed toward a small windowless alcove near the medical wing. "That is where you stay. My guards will be at the door. You start tomorrow at dawn. And Nara," he added, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, "don't think for a second that I won't follow through on that contract. In this house I am the only power that matters." Nara simply nodded, her gaze drifting toward the darkened garden outside, where she could already hear the silent call of the roots waiting beneath the expensive, artificial turf. The first light of dawn was a pale, clinical gray, as it filtered through the reinforced glass of the Vanderbilt estate. Nara had not slept. The air in the mansion was too still, stripped of the natural vibrations of the earth she used to navigate the world. Under the watchful, unblinking eyes of two security guards, she was escorted out of her small alcove and toward the sprawling backyard. To Arthur Vanderbilt, this garden was a masterpiece of human control, a 3-acre expanse of hybrid roses, imported Japanese maples, and grass so perfectly leveled it looked like green velvet. But as Nara stepped onto the lawn, she felt a profound sense of mourning. The land was screaming beneath the chemical fertilizers and the heavy hand of the mowers. Arthur stood on the patio, a cup of black coffee in his hand, his eyes bloodshot from a night of obsessing over legal loopholes and medical data. "You have 10 minutes to find whatever magic you think is out here," he called out, his voice raspy. "My gardeners use the best organic treatments in the world. There isn't a single wild thing left in this soil." Nara didn't answer. She closed her eyes, letting her bare feet sink into the damp artificial turf. She wasn't looking with her eyes. She was listening for a pulse. She ignored the expensive roses and the decorative hedges, moving instead toward the very edge of the property, where a massive stone fence met a cluster of neglected rocks. There, tucked in a shadowed corner where the automatic sprinklers couldn't quite reach, was a low, jagged bush with waxy, dark leaves. It was ugly by Vanderbilt standards, thorny, persistent and scarred by years of industrial strength weed killer. Arthur scoffed, walking down the stone steps as he saw her kneel before the scrub. "That's a nuisance. My head gardener has tried to poison that patch for 5 years. It keeps coming back. It's a parasite." Nara reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the bitter leaf. "It is not a parasite," she whispered, her voice thick with reverence. "It is a survivor. The more you try to kill it, the deeper it hides its life." She began to dig with her bare hands, ignoring the sharp stones and the thorns that drew beads of crimson blood from her palm. Arthur watched, a look of revulsion crossing his face as he saw the billionaire's soil being churned by the witch girl's fingernails. After several minutes of frantic digging, Nara let out a soft, triumphant gasp. From the dark, compressed earth emerged a thick, gnarled root, the color of a fresh wound. It was the red root, a botanical anomaly that shouldn't have been able to grow in this climate, let alone in a garden saturated with toxin. As the air hit the root, it seemed to glow with a dull, inner warmth. "This is the heart of the matter," Nara said, standing up and holding the muddy object toward Arthur, as if it were a diamond. "Your son's nerves are like a river that has been frozen by fear and trauma. This root has lived through your poisons and your hatred. It knows how to wake up when the world wants it dead." Arthur stepped back, his logical mind screaming that this was madness. He looked at the muddy, bleeding girl and the hideous tuber in her. "You expect me to believe that a weed my gardeners couldn't kill is going to fix a spinal cord injury that the Zurich Institute couldn't touch?" "I expect nothing from you, sir," Nara replied, her eyes flashing with a sudden, ancient power that made the guards take a half step back. "I only ask that you honor the contract. Take me to your kitchen. I need fire, water, and the boy." Arthur looked at the root, then at the mansion where his son sat in a gilded cage. For the first time he noticed that Nara wasn't looking at him with the fear most people did. She was looking at him with pity. It was the look of someone who held a secret the rest of the world was too poor to buy. "Take her inside," Arthur barked to the guards, though his hand shook as he drained his coffee. The battle between the laboratory and the earth had officially begun. The Vanderbilt kitchen, a cathedral of brushed steel and German-engineered appliances, became the unlikely battleground for a war between two eras of human understanding. Nara stood at the center island, her mud-streaked dress a stark violation of the room's sterile perfection. She had placed a simple stainless steel pot over a blue gas flame, the water beginning to hiss as she prepared to submerge the gnarled red root. Beside her, Eris Thorne, Arthur's lead neurologist and a man whose wall was covered in degrees from Johns Hopkins and Oxford, watched her with a contempt so sharp it was almost physical. He adjusted his white lab coat, his arms folded tightly across his chest as if to protect himself from the very air she breathed. "Arthur, this is beyond a lapse in judgment. It's a criminal liability," Dr. Thorne said, his voice echoing off the marble walls. He pointed a manicured finger at the pot. "We don't know the alkaloid content of that thing. It hasn't been screened for toxicity, heavy metals or neuroinhibitors. You are allowing a vagrant to administer an unregulated substance to a patient with a compromised neural path. If he goes into anaphylaxis or suffers a cardiac event, my team will not be held responsible for the fallout." Arthur stood by the doorway, his silhouette framed by the morning light. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, torn between the expensive, failed certainties of the doctor and the terrifying, unproven hope of the girl. He looked at Leo, who sat in his wheelchair at the end of the table, watching Nara with an intensity that bordered on hunger. Nara didn't look up from the pot. She used a small silver knife, one typically reserved for paring expensive fruits, to shave thin, translucent slices of the root into the water. "You call it a substance," she said, her voice a calm, low hum that seemed to vibrate beneath the doctor's frantic tone. "You want to break it down into numbers and names, but your numbers have failed this boy for 10 years. You have mapped every inch of his spine, yet you still cannot tell him why his legs have forgotten how to listen to his heart, because medicine is a discipline of facts, not fairy tales." Thorne snapped, stepping forward. "The spinal cord is a delicate highway of bioelectrical signal. We use targeted electromagnetic stimulation and neuroregeneration therapy. We don't use garden waste and superstition." Nara finally turned, her eyes locking onto the doctor's with a weight that made his breath hitch. "You see the highway, doctor, but you do not see the traveler. The traveler is Leo, and he is tired of your machines. He is tired of being treated like a broken clock." She gestured toward the pot, where the water had turned a deep, bruised purple. "This root did not grow in a lab. It grew in the dark under the weight of stones, surviving the very poisons your people used to try and kill it. It holds the memory of how to push through a blockage. It is not a drug. It is a reminder." The aroma began to fill the kitchen, a thick, earthy scent of rain-soaked soil and ancient wood. It was a smell that felt older than the mansion, older than the city itself. Arthur found himself stepping closer, drawn by a primal instinct he couldn't name. Dr. Thorne pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency contact for the Board of Medicine. One sip, Arthur. That's all it takes for a lawsuit to become a funeral. But Leo reached out, his hand shaking, and touched his father's arm. Let her, Dad. He whispered. The doctors have spent 10 years telling me why I can't. I want to listen to someone who says I can. Arthur looked at Nara, then at the purple steam rising from the pot. He saw the scars on Nara's hands from the garden, and the defiance in her posture. He turned to Dr. Thorne. Put the phone away, Aris. We aren't in a hospital anymore. We're in a gamble, and for the first time in a decade, I'm betting on the earth. The doctor went pale, retreating into the corner like a man watching a train wreck in slow motion, while Nara poured the first cup of the steaming bitter brew. The transition from the kitchen to Leo's bedroom was a descent into a heavy airless silence. The purple steam of the red root had settled into a thick, visceral scent that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains and the high-tech medical monitors. For the first 6 hours after Leo drank the bitter brew, nothing happened. He simply lay beneath his silk sheets, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling while Arthur paced the hallway, the sound of his leather soles echoing like a countdown. But as the clock struck midnight, the stillness shattered. Leo's body began to jerk, a violent, rhythmic tremor that started in his chest and radiated outward. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips, and within minutes his skin, usually pale and cool, was radiating a heat so intense it could be felt from the doorway. Dr. Thorne rushed to the bedside, his face pale with a mix of terror and professional vindication. He pressed a digital thermometer to Leo's forehead, and watched the numbers climb. 39 Kurshti, 40 Kurshti, 40 Kurshti. The alkaloids are attacking his nervous system. His heart rate is at 140 and climbing. Arthur, I told you, this isn't healing. It's a slow-motion execution. Arthur burst into the room, his eyes wide with horror as he saw his son drenched in sweat, his back arching off the mattress. Leo, look at me. Arthur turned his fury toward Nara, who stood at the foot of the bed, her hands folded, her expression as unmoving as a statue's. What did you do to him? You promised me a miracle, and you've given him a death sentence. Call the ambulance. Call the police. The mansion erupted into chaos. The guards moved in, their heavy hands seizing Nara's arms, pulling her back toward the door. The lead guard's grip was like iron, bruising her skin. But Nara didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She looked past the violence, past the billionaire's rage, and fixed her eyes on Leo's thrashing form. Do not stop the heat, Nara said, her voice a calm, piercing bell in the middle of the storm. The fever is not an enemy. It is the fire needed to melt the ice in his nerve. If you cool him now, the blockage will set like stone forever. You're insane, Thorne hissed, preparing a sedative to counteract the reaction. His brain will cook at this temperature. This is biology, not a village ritual. As the doctor reached for the IV port, Nara broke free from the guards with a sudden, desperate strength. She didn't attack. She threw herself toward the bed, grabbing Leo's hand. Leo, listen to my voice. The pain is the bridge. Don't run from it. Walk through it. Arthur was inches away from ordering the guards to drag her out by her hair when he saw it. The heart monitor, which had been beeping a frantic, high-pitched alarm, suddenly leveled into a steady, powerful throb. Leo's eyes snapped open, not with the glazed look of a dying boy, but with a terrifying, lucid focus. He wasn't looking at his father or the doctor. He was looking at his own legs. Dad, Leo gasped, his voice a ragged whisper that cut through the shouting. The room went dead silent. A single heavy bead of sweat rolled down his cheek. It doesn't hurt. Leo, you're burning up, Arthur sobbed, leaning over him. No, Leo said, a strange ecstatic light beginning to glow in his eyes. I'm not burning. I'm feeling. I can feel the floor. I can feel the weight of the blanket. Dad. The silence is gone. There's a noise in my feet. It's like electricity. Dr. Thorne froze, his sedative needle hovering in midair. He looked at the monitor. The neural activity wasn't a seizure. It was a cascade of firing synapses, a massive, uncoordinated reawakening of the nerve pathways that had been dormant for a decade. Nara slowly let go of Leo's hand and stepped back, her chest heaving, the green stains on her fingers now mixed with the dust of the billionaire's floor. She looked at Arthur, whose face was a mask of shattered pride and burgeoning disbelief. The fever has broken the ice, she said quietly. Now he must sleep. When he wakes, the world will be different. Arthur sank into a chair, his head in his hands, as the violent tremors subsided into a deep restorative rest, leaving the mansion in a state of breathless, terrifying anticipation.
The seventh morning arrived, not with the gentle touch of dawn, but with the harsh, rhythmic flashing of red and blue lights against the marble facade of the Vanderbilt mansion. Arthur stood in the grand foyer, his face a hollowed-out wreck of a man who had traded his sanity for a ghost of a hope. He had barely slept, his ears ringing with the accusations of Dr. Thorne, who had spent the night calling every legal and medical authority he knew. The contract was no longer a private agreement, it was a public scandal. The heavy thud of boots echoed on the driveway as 3 police cruisers and an ambulance skidded to a halt. "Mr. G. Vanderbilt, we have a warrant for the removal of the minor and the arrest of the individual identified as Nara for practicing medicine without a license and reckless endangerment," the lead officer announced, his voice booming through the vaulted entrance. Arthur looked toward the staircase, his heart sinking. Nara was being escorted down by 2 guards, her expression unreadable, her hands already positioned as if expecting the cold bite of handcuffs. She looked smaller in the vastness of the hall, a fragile figure of earth and tattered fabric surrounded by the polished steel of authority. "Wait," Arthur croaked, stepping forward to block the officer's path. "The time isn't up. The sun hasn't fully cleared the horizon." "Arthur, enough," Dr. Thorne shouted from the landing, pointing at Nara with a shaking hand. "Look at her. She's a charlatan who nearly killed your son with a botanical poison. He hasn't moved a muscle in 24 hours. He's in a deep, possibly catatonic state. Every second you delay, his brain is at risk." The officers pushed past Arthur, their heavy belts clinking. They reached Nara, and the click of the handcuffs echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "You're coming with us, girl," the officer muttered, pulling her toward the door. Nara didn't resist. She didn't plead. She simply turned her head toward the upper balcony and whispered, "Leo, the earth is waiting. Get her out of here." Thorne barked, but then a sound stopped everyone in their tracks. It wasn't a scream or a cry, it was a thud, a heavy, deliberate footfall against the hardwood of the upper gallery. Then another, and another. The police froze. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat, a sound of pure, agonizing terror that turned into a strangled sob. Slowly, leaning heavily against the mahogany railing, Leo appeared. He was barefoot, dressed in simple cotton pajamas, his face pale but determined. His legs, which for a decade had been nothing but decorative weight, were trembling violently, the muscles ropey and strained as they fought to remember a function they had long ago abandoned. The doctor's jaw dropped. The police officers stepped back, their hands falling away from Nara. Leo took another step. It was clumsy, a dragging of the heel followed by a desperate stomp of the toe, but it was a step. He reached the top of the grand staircase and looked down at his father. "Dad," Leo gasped, sweat pouring down his face. The ground. It's so cold. I can feel every single tile." Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half wail, and ran toward the stairs, but he stopped at the bottom, his hands outstretched but not touching, as if afraid the vision would shatter if he interfered. Leo began to descend. 1 step, 2, his knees buckled, but he caught himself. He was using his own strength, his own nervous system, firing signals down a path that Nara's red root had cleared like a forest fire. By the time Leo reached the final step, the entire household had gathered in the foyer. The maids were weeping into their aprons, the guards stood in stunned silence. Leo reached the bottom and stood unassisted for 3 long, miraculous seconds before leaning into his father's arm. "She didn't curse me," Leo whispered, looking over his father's shoulder at Nara, who stood by the door, still in handcuffs. "She woke me up." Arthur turned to the police, his eyes blazing with a ferocity that made the lead officer fumble for his key. "Unlock her," Arthur commanded, his voice a roar of billionaire authority. "Unlock her right now, and Dr. Thorne, pack your bags." You spent 10 years telling me why this was impossible. She spent 7 days showing me why it wasn't. The officer quickly turned the key, and the handcuffs fell to the floor with a dull metallic clang. Nara didn't run to Leo, and she didn't boast. She simply walked over to the open door, looking out at the morning sun that was now fully visible over the horizon. The miracle was complete, but as the world's cameras began to descend on the Vanderbilt gates, the true battle for Nara's name was only just beginning. The news of Leo Vanderbilt's recovery moved through the world like a tidal wave, crashing over the barriers of medical skepticism and social prejudice. Within 48 hours, the Vanderbilt mansion was no longer a fortress of private grief, but the epicenter of a global phenomenon. Reporters from every major network stood outside the iron gates, their lenses trained on the white marble walls, waiting for a glimpse of the miracle girl. But inside, the atmosphere was one of profound, quiet transformation. Arthur Vanderbilt sat in his study, not looking at stock tickers or merger agreements, but at a live feed of his son. Leo was in the garden, the very same garden where the red root had been found, walking with a slow, deliberate gait, his feet finally reclaiming the earth. Arthur knew that a miracle of this magnitude required more than just a thank you note. It required justice. He summoned his global communications team and the same legal battalion that had once drafted Nara's prison contract. This time, their orders were different. He didn't want a defense, he wanted a crusade. He spent millions to track down the history of Omu village, documented the ancient lineage of Nara's grandmother, and hired researchers to map the neuroregenerative properties of the red root. He used his influence to ensure that the word witch was systematically scrubbed from the digital record, replaced by the term healer of the New Age. A week later, Arthur stood on a stage in the city's most prestigious auditorium, with Nara at his side. She was no longer wearing the torn, mud-stained dress. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that mirrored the color of the herbs she loved. She looked regal, her natural coils crowned with a simple gold band, yet her eyes remained grounded, unfazed by the flashing cameras. For years I believed that progress was measured only by the complexity of our machines. Arthur told the hushed crowd, his voice resonating with a newfound humility. I was wrong. True progress is the humility to listen to the wisdom we tried to bury. Nara didn't just save my son's legs. She saved my soul from the arrogance of thinking money could buy everything. He then announced the launch of the Nara Institute of Biospirituality, a state-of-the-art research and wellness center built on the edge of the city, where the urban sprawl met the wild forest. It wasn't a hospital, it was a bridge. It was a place where modern neurologists would work alongside traditional herbalists, where the data of the brain would finally meet the intuition of the heart. Back in the village of Omu, the change was even more dramatic. The same elders who had cast Nara out now sat in stunned silence as a fleet of Vanderbilt-branded trucks arrived, not to bring soldiers, but to build a modern school and a clean water system in Nara's name. The village head, once so quick to point a finger of accusation, now boasted to anyone who would listen that he had always seen the divine spark in the girl. But Nara didn't return to seek their apologies. She had outgrown the smallness of their fear. On the evening the institute opened, Nara stood on the rooftop terrace with Leo. He was standing tall now, the tremors in his legs replaced by a solid rhythmic strength. He looked out at the city lights, then down at his own feet, still marveling at the simple sensation of balance. They're calling you a hero now, Leo said, glancing at the headlines on his phone. The witch is now the wonder. Nara smiled, a soft, distant expression that held the memory of the market gutters and the cold rain of the village. The labels don't matter, Leo. They called me a witch when they were afraid, and they call me a hero because they are relieved. But I am still just Nara. I am the girl who listens to the root. She looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of purple and gold, the same colors as the medicine that had changed their lives. The legacy she had built wasn't in the marble of the Institute or the billions in the Vanderbilt Trust. It was in the fact that somewhere, a child with a strange gift would no longer have to hide in the shadows. The poor girl had become the wealthiest woman in the world,
not because of the coins in her pocket, but because she had forced a world of logic to believe in the impossible. As the first stars appeared, Nara took a deep breath of the night air, finally free, finally heard, and finally